I really want to kick straight in with a quote from a human rights detention monitor talking about a prison visit. At exactly 12:15, I entered the reception office of the prison, unnoticed by the 5 officers, including the officer in charge of reception and his second in command. I took 2 steps and said, "Hello." They were shocked. I could sense it from their body language. "You entered like a ghost," said the officer in charge, and we all laughed. As we were laughing, 3 of the prisoners' leaders entered. We began to make fun with each other. They said, "I'm part of them now, as my presence in the prison is so regular." And I told them that, yes, I'm the public relations man between them and the free world. And we laughed about the issue. This is an almost intimate scene. Of note is the ghost-like arrival of the prison's monitor, the laughter shared with guards and with prisoners, and the monitor's obvious familiarity with the prison and its occupants. This is what I'm going to talk about this evening, the more or less entangled encounters between rights-based NGOs and prisons. My point of departure is a 2-year research project conducted with and through 3 NGOs, one in Kosovo in the former Yugoslavia, one in Sierra Leone in West Africa, and one in the Philippines. I'll try to show you how NGO prison encounters vary from country to country, depending absolutely on context. And I'll show that relationships are characterized not by independence and neutrality, but by interdependence and a more or less deep and meaningful engagement. I'll argue that notions of independence that float around as apparent ideals to live up to by human rights organizations engaged in prison reform, engaged in anti-torture work, are at best ill-conceived and at worst counterproductive, though that might actually be putting it a little too strongly. But first, let me get back to protocol. I'd like to thank, obviously, Reed College for inviting me to speak and for hosting my partner Lodren and I so generously. I'd like to thank Professor Rajali for the invitation, but particularly for his camaraderie, his warmth, the opportunities he's granted me as an apprentice social scientist and a sort of fellow sojourner in life over many years now. I'd like to thank the students from the torture prevention class who've also shown up this evening. That's twice they get to listen to me. And I'd like to thank Jolie Griffin for doing such amazing organizing of this event. Fantastic. Clearly well deserved. And thanks to you all for coming. I appreciate the chance to present this book to you. I'd hoped that I could actually have the book physically in my hand. All you get is the front and back cover to look at, but it should be out in April. Okay, you may well, if you picked it up, oh, these are the 3 NGOs. Did I skip something already? No. Okay. You may have a copy of this image. It's the cover of the book that narrates the story I'm going to tell today in much more detail. As you can see, it's called Human Rights in Prisons, Comparing Institutional Encounters. It's a pretty boring title, to be honest. I wanted to call it Entangled Encounters in Prisons, but the publisher said that nobody sort of uses entangled encounters when they're looking for a book on prisons. So it simply didn't fly. And it is a very accurate title. It is a book that compares institutional encounters. And it is kind of about human rights, and it's definitely about prisons. I want to draw your attention to the back cover, where there's a whole bunch of people named there. I circle them up here. Merle, Karl, Meltz, Dieter, Adnan, Mimosa, Alban, Mambu, Kadi, Ahmed. These are the people through whom we conducted the research. These are the people that Darius has seen photographs of meeting up in Copenhagen. They are the staff members of the 3 NGOs I worked with and through. They're the co-researchers, the observers, the monitors, the activists, the interviewers, the field note takers. the frontline people without whom there would have been no project, without whom there would have been no book. So I'm immensely grateful to these people, and I really feel I had to fight with the publisher to get their names on the back. It's a bit unusual, but I want to name them just again to acknowledge the debt. They deserve massive credit. The three NGOs, if I go backwards, Kosovo Rehabilitation Center, Prison Watch in Sierra Leone, and Balai Rehabilitation Center in the Philippines. These are the three organizations I'm going to name repeatedly, so I hope you can pick up my shorthand version of their names. Each of them is involved in the business of bringing about change and assisting people in prisons. They were included in the project because of their generic similarity and their specific differences. Broadly speaking, each organization aims to improve prison conditions, support prisoners, counter torture and inhumane treatment in places of detention, and promote human rights. None of them would disagree that that was their main aim. Yet whilst they generally occupy this shared platform in the fight against torture and for human rights, less explicitly perhaps for prison reform, each of the three organizations has features that distinguish them from each other. Balai, in the Philippines, were chosen due to their commitment to the idea of the humane prison, and for their long-term engagement with political prisoners and prison authorities. Their intimate knowledge about prisons and their organizational tradition for critical reflection upon their own practices made them an attractive collaborating partner for the project. Prison Watch were chosen because of the way they were caught up in and nurtured some uncommon relationships with the prison authorities. While in their early days they had a quite confrontative relationship, today they enjoy a very close collaborative relationship through which they both critique and develop the prisons in Sierra Leone. KRCT were chosen due to their particular interest in relationships between prisoners and staff, and they represent actually a more classic approach to torture prevention based on monitoring the state's compliance with human rights norms and minimum standards for prisons. Now, these are the real names of the organizations. There's no secret behind this. So I should add a small caveat at least. The representations of them in the book and in my talk are of course only partial representations. The organizations and the people working in them inevitably exceed any representation I can give of them, make of them. Also, organizationally, their work in prison is only one aspect of their work. They do much more than just work in prison. And also, the material that we collected was mostly collected during 2012 and 2013, so it's possible they look quite differently today. But anyway, in one sense, this caveat might even be redundant, because my study is not a comparison of the three NGOs. Neither is it an exhaustive comparison of prisons in these three rather different countries. What it is, and hopefully this will be emphasized throughout my talk, what it is a comparison of the encounters between NGOs and prisons in these three countries. And that is actually quite a significant difference. So it's a comparison of encounters, not a comparison of prisons or a comparison of NGOs. It's the point of connection between that is of particular interest for the project. Now, the original research question that informed the study was as follows: why and how do reform projects in different settings have particular effects? Now, a chance like this is an opportunity to be a little bit confessional, and to be honest, this was a bad research question. It proved pretty ill-conceived, at least, mainly because it failed to take account of the possibility that effects can, of course, go in more than one direction. So it's not only reform projects that have effects, though perhaps we often think about it like that, because they're supposed to reform something. but reform projects are also affected. So the answer to a revised version of this question, recognizing that effects can in fact go in multiple directions, is one of the central findings of the project. Prisons affect NGOs as much, if not more, than NGOs affect prisons. And this is actually quite significant. Now, let me say something about prisons. Prisons are complex places. They're filled often with anguish, with uncertainty. They do what I call collateral damage. And I want to say a little bit before talking about the encounters, about what our study contributes to how we understand prisons in general, or prisons specifically. It was a project that had both conceptual and empirical ambitions, and we do believe that we have something important, if you like, to say about prisons as institutions. And what we propose is this. We propose that prisons would be best or better understood as relational institutions, as fundamentally relational institutions. And why is this important? This is important because we typically think about prisons in terms of their function. We fight about whether prisons are for warehousing or for rehabilitation or for corrections or for reform or to prevent crime. And we never end up agreeing what they're actually for. And I actually find it much more productive to think about what they are in terms of the kind of relationships that are within them. So I think this is a significant move, actually. So relations are central to prisons. I think they deserve a much more central place in our characterizations of what prisons are. And of course, prisons are places of punishment. They are places of shame. They are places of pain and stigma and so on. But they're first and foremost, from our perspective at least, social, or more accurately, antisocial social institutions, if that makes sense for you. Okay, let me jump to the encounter. Why did we choose to give primacy to encounters in the first place? The idea of the encounter emerged, actually, as a way of thinking about prisons from more than a decade of ethnographic fieldwork in prisons, mostly in Africa. In earlier work on prisons in Nigeria and Sierra Leone, the encounter came into view via consideration of the entangled nature of two key aspects of prisons. These were firstly the relationships between prisoners and staff, and secondly, relations between the inside and outside of the prisons. And if you know your Goffman, you'll realize that these are sort of classic examples of what a total institution is. Prisoners and staff are divided, inside and outside are divided. This is not what we find in prisons in Nigeria and Sierra Leone. There we have relationships that were characterized more by cordiality and commonality than by enmity and distinctiveness. And the prisons themselves characterized more by porosity, permeability, and relations of exchange than by sharp distinctions between the inside and the outside. So the degree to which encounters between prisons and NGOs are also entangled, and the different kinds and levels of entanglement are ultimately empirical questions that the book explores in quite a lot of detail. It features a description, or the book, it features a description of the project's rationale and methodology, as well as substantive chapters about prison officers, about prisoners, and perhaps most importantly about the relationship between the two. And in those chapters, there's a lot to learn about prison life and its similarities and differences across the three countries. I'm not going to talk about that today. We also spend a whole chapter describing the NGOs get access to prisons. Access is a huge theme in prison research, understandably enough. And I'll say a little bit about that. There are formal means through which NGOs get access, but during each visit, they sort of have to revisit the access procedures. Each visit involves an entry procedure that is of interest. And these entry procedures give us material to actually say something about the encounter between the prison and in the NGO. And it's during the points of contact, especially that initial contact as they go through the gates again and again and again, that both personal and institutional subjectivities are getting formed, often quite potently. So let me give you some examples. In Kosovo, the entrance procedures are characterized by formal and distant relations with prison staff. KRCT are formally received as monitors. They're put through standard access procedures. They have an official meeting with the director of the prison. There are searches. There are handing over of mobile phones and money or whatever else they're carrying, phones. They pass through an X-ray machine and so on. And it's descriptions of these kinds of procedures that actually fill the notes of the co-researchers. It's not descriptions of relations of trust or suspicion or camaraderie, as we find in some of the other notes in the other countries. The focus of KRCT, as I mentioned, is basically on bringing the prison in line with international standards, rather than catering to prisoners' or staff's immediate needs or concerns. KRCT's encounters are often first encounters. Only occasionally do they establish deep relations over time with prisoners or with staff. This is partly a result of their relatively infrequent visits and the resultant sporadic contact. So let's read what one of the co-researchers wrote. He says, when we were inside the prison, it was really weird for me. I had some mixed feelings, a little scared, unsafe. I felt sorry for them as well. They were locked into the wings and they looked at us curiously. I heard someone say hi to us. Probably they thought we were from UNMIK, the UN, or just foreigners. Sorry, this was a female co-researcher. So the co-researcher reports how prisoners greeted her and her colleagues as strangers, but only in passing. It was not an intimate kind of greeting. It wasn't the same story as the one I read for you right at the beginning. She feels wary. She observes that they were probably not even recognized as coming from KRCT. And this is a rather strong contrast to the situation in Sierra Leone, where the staff of Prison Watch are at least well-known and familiar faces, both to staff and to inmates. For the KRCT monitor, the prison invokes a kind of some feelings of identification and even pity towards the prisoners. Another co-researcher described his feelings in the following words. There's a strange feeling, he says, while walking between pavilions and being watched by inmates. I try to imagine myself in their position. How would I feel if I was seeing someone coming from outside? Would I envy them for being free to leave at any time? This co-researcher, presumably unwittingly, kind of puts the ethnographic lens a little bit in reverse. He notes how he feels watched. He feels under the scrutiny of the institution he's there to scrutinize. KRCT's interaction with the prison may be characterized more by distance than closeness, but they do register when prison officers mock them, for example. They do sense hostility when it's present. It's actually not a very friendly relationship that they seem to have, as the following notes illustrate. We're constantly escorted by a senior officer. On our way to the hospital, I can hear the officer making some inappropriate remarks to the other co-researcher, asking her about her origins, mentioning some special rooms for girls like her. Is this supposed to be funny? She tries to ignore these remarks, but I can see she's uncomfortable. Across the three NGOs, and I've only talked about KRCT really so far, across the three NGOs, there are varying degrees to which one senses that they belong or are alien to the prison. KRCT are the most alien. In contrast, Prison Watch see themselves and are seen as people with a kind of intimate knowledge of the prison. Prisoners welcome them. Prison staff say to them, "You know our prisons." They're not outsiders. They belong to the degree that they are seen as being there for prisoners and to the degree that they identify with the problems of staff and have staff identify with them. Balai, they belong, in a way, through their identification with political prisoners, who are their main target group, though actually levels of solidarity vary rather from staff member to staff member. But they can also be made to feel alien, for example, when subject to a search during entry procedures. And such an incident invoked the following outburst from one of our co-researchers. She repeated that I had to remove my pants for a thorough search. She said it was the rules. After a couple of minutes of haggling, I gave in, but retorted that what happened will be brought to the attention of the warden and the headquarters. After the encounter, I've lost any friendliness, if there'd been any, towards this ugly-looking guard. I hate the smirk on her face and how she smiled with the other new and young lady guards at the guardhouse. I hate what happened. I was silent most of the time after that. I'll never forget her annoying face. This is quite an emotional field note, and emotional responses constitute an important channel through which NGO staff make sense of and process their experiences. And in our project, we try to encourage the co-researchers to be attentive to their own emotions when they wrote field notes. As Helen Arnold, a prison scholar from the UK, shared with me, emotional reactions while in prison are routes to understanding that prison. They're they help us gauge the character of the prison, is the way Helen put it. Another prison scholar, Yvonne Jukes, has written the following, again, a rather long quote, but I think it captures something really important, actually. She writes, despite only experiencing a tiny fraction of the restrictive binds of carceral space and time, researchers nonetheless cannot help but be touched, if not deeply affected, by the cultural isolation and emotional intensity of confinement, even though they are largely experiencing it at one step removed and in relatively short doses. Prisons are intensely human environments giving rise to acute difficulties, dilemmas, complexities, and contradictions. They are peculiar places from a sensory perspective, managing to deny and deprive while sometimes simultaneously overloading the senses. Now, I'm guessing you're not prison scholars, very many of you, but when I read this, it resonated so clearly with my experience of doing research in prisons, whether that was in West Africa or working in UK prisons or Danish prisons or wherever. This really caught it, especially this last thing about denying and depriving whilst simultaneously overloading. I mean, so she's writing about researchers. Obviously, the same applies for NGO people, especially those who have a very close and regular presence in the prison. And I'm not sure that's always acknowledged. It's actually possible to trace some differences in triggers of emotional stress across the three organizations. The stressful and unpleasant encounters experienced by Balai staff often took place during entry procedures inside the prison, and one of the prisons they visit has 19,000 inmates. Inside the prison, they felt relatively safe in the custody of the political prisoners whom they see as their partners. That's not to say they never faced unpleasantness or felt uncomfortable. The co-researchers, for example, had highly visceral reactions to the state of the hospital in this 19,000-man place. KRCT staff, on the other hand, experienced the inside of the prisons as relatively anxiety-provoking due to the prison's relative unfamiliarity. They were like, as I mentioned before, kind of sympathetic, wary strangers compared with Prison Watch and Balai. What Prison Watch staff seemed to suffer from was the kind of constant travails of close involvement with the prison's daily life, and from the demands of people whose expectations they were not always able to fulfill. So having a regular, constant presence has sort of negative effects as well, or things that are difficult to handle. Okay, so far, I've really just offered a glimpse of the NGOs and pulled out some of the differences. I want to spell out the most distinctive characteristics of the different styles of encounter and explore how these differences can be explained as meaningful products of context. It makes sense that they do their work differently despite their shared sort of generic platform against torture and for human rights. We can analyze encounters along multiple dimensions. Those that emerged as most important in our study were the characteristics of the key players, the basis for the encounter, the type of the encounter, the quality of the encounter. And central to understanding the differences were proximity, closeness, intimacy, power, also an issue, mostly weighted in favor of the prison. So to take KRCT first of all, as I mentioned, KRCT exemplify to a rather high degree the classic preventive legal medical monitoring paradigm being applied and in a newly emerging state. Now this is also worth remembering. KRCT and Kosovo basically emerged at the same time, post the war in Yugoslavia. And KRCT are as committed to the national Kosovan project as the state is. And yet KRCT are kind of a watchdog on the state. There's a kind of irony there that maybe says something about why they sort of keep a respectful distance. Visits to prisons are relatively sporadic, they're highly formalized, and there is a kind of stubborn distance between KRCT and the individual prisons. Relationships with staff, with inmates are impersonal and professional. The KRCT staff do not know the prisons or the representatives of prison to anywhere near the same degree that Prison Watch and Belay do. The prisons and the prisoners in themselves are relatively unimportant, actually, to KRCT. KRCT in the prisons can kind of be imagined to sort of exist as operating on parallel tracks. Occasionally there are points of contact, opportunities for brief exchanges, a monitoring visit, a training event for staff. And KRCT staff wouldn't conceive of themselves as working with the authorities to any great degree at all. They're primarily external monitors, lobbyists, and occasional trainers. But this actually isn't the whole story. If I tell it too much like that, I would be creating a false impression. Because occasionally the impression is broken. To my surprise, for example, when I'm having lunch with one of the staff members, and he talks animatedly on the telephone for 10 minutes, and I said, "So who are you talking to?" He said, "Oh, a prisoner just called me from the jail." What is a prisoner doing? He's not allowed a phone. He's calling you? And what kind of a relationship do you have that the prisoner just calls you? Okay, so that rocked a little bit with the imagination of this sort of impersonal, distant relationship. So even my most distant kind of case was not totally distant after all. But the image of parallel lines is a fairly persuasive metaphor from our point of view for thinking about KRCT's relationship to the prisons in Kosovo. Prison Watch, in comparison, the prisons in Sierra Leone are highly intertwined. We cannot imagine them in terms of parallel lines at all. The institutions interact a lot. They are fundamentally interlocked in many ways. And I mentioned the state in Kosovo. In Sierra Leone, we have a very different state of affairs. We have a very fragile state, very weak state structures, endemic poverty, and a highly neglected prison system, and justice system in general. So Prison Watch, in this context, they essentially support the authorities. Sometimes they provide services. They do things that would traditionally be seen as the mandate of the prison itself. You know, they provide mattresses for inmates. They'd ensure contact with the outside world for inmates. They'd give advice on how to build up sort of categorization or classification systems of inmates that help them with their record keeping, or even would be called in by the authorities to try to maintain order if disorder threatened. So this is an unusual role for an NGO, if you like. Not particularly oppositional. They have a history of opposition, though. They have a history of confrontation. And even today, they're actually quite outspoken when necessary. One could say that they've strategically sought this interlocked relationship, that they, in a way, exploit the weakness of the system to position themselves as kind of indispensable, so that they have a credible and informed voice with which to speak out on behalf of prisoners. Their intimate relations with the prison, including those in the provinces where they have local volunteer monitors, it exemplifies a kind of multiple point of entry strategy responding to needs under these fragile and quite volatile conditions. Of course, the risk of bolstering the system that they actually wish to transform is rather high. But the director is quite aware of this, and he once said to me, when I asked him about this, he says, "We work with but not for the prison authorities." I thought that was a very nice sort of, showed a lot of self-awareness. So it's probably accurate to claim that Prison Watch doesn't actually work against the authorities. Staff, Prison Watch staff, often actually uncritically and naively accept the dominant conceptions of the prison, or the prison's intended function, and the idea that prison staff would say that, you know, prisoners are malingerers and they're recalcitrant, and sometimes they take these values on board themselves, actually. But this is not to say that they don't speak against the authorities. They most certainly do. Sometimes it's publicly via radio programs and press releases, or more often via quieter channels of internal diplomacy, training events, specially designed sort of interactive forums where they get to express their points of view. So Prison Watch have the most regular presence in prisons and the closest and most intimate relations with them. Balai's position, Balai in the Philippines, is much more paradoxical. They have strong historical links with the leftist movement and the movement that was against Marcos in that period. They also provide services to Muslims, who today are also perceived, like the leftists used to be, as enemies of the state. So they have this sort of identification, if you like, with those opposed to the state, or at least they provide services to them. And yet they also work with the state, with the prison authorities, as a kind of tactic. What we also see with Balai is much greater variation in proximity. They're close to some prisoner groups, but very far from others. They're close to certain staff groups, but very far from others. They are a regular presence in some prisons, but totally absent from others. This is a question of scale. The Philippines compared with Sierra Leone, it's a different kettle of fish. So Balai exemplifies solidarity-based and service delivery-minded collaborations with people and institutions in what we might call an elite-driven, still divided democratic state. They're highly connected with certain key actors, but their chief encounter is with the political prisoners whom they consider partners. If Prison Watch's closeness to prisons is related to their intersection with the authorities, then Balai's closeness to prisons is connected to their interlocking relationship with prisoners, with particular prisons. And personal relationships and regular contact between social workers and prisoners' families is central and absolutely central to Balai's work. Investment in the relationship with the authorities is basically a means to an end rather than an end in itself. They don't see themselves as in the same business as the authorities at all. Rather, they seek to realign the goals of the authorities, for example, towards respect for human rights, towards the idea of humane prisons. They do this sometimes through close alliances with individual representatives of the prison authorities who seem to share a similarly sort of humanistic orientation, even when they fear they might contribute to window dressing. So again, like Prison Watch, they are sort of sensitive of the risks involved with these connections. So they offer services and training as a means through which to advocate. But services, I think we can understand services also as a form of advocacy. Prison Watch is prison presence. Their simple engagement with the authorities is also an intervention. And an intervention is always an opportunity to plant seeds and to affect attitudes. But it's a modest kind of intervention. It's piecemeal. In the Philippines, the sheer bulk of the prison machinery means that Balai will always face an uphill battle because of the vastness of the prison system. They cannot be everywhere. So beyond the relatively few jails and prisons that they work in, So the encounter could be characterized in terms of the image of parallel tracks, like in Kosovo. But where they do work, they have a relationship which is much closer to that in Sierra Leone with Prison Watch. So what emerges most strongly in these descriptions of the differences in styles of encounter and the degree is the degree to which they depend inherently on the prison. The size of the prison, the situation of the prison, the characteristics, the history of the prison. So I've not been able to give you so many details here, but the NGOs, in a general sense, appear to be fundamentally reactive. Their room for maneuver, or their possibilities, their scope, their reach, are to a large degree determined almost by the prisons themselves. The prisons are forming, molding, disciplining the NGOs in the same way that they attempt to form, mold, transform their occupants. So this is an encounter that is loaded and unequal. If you remember, I said at the beginning that our question was about the effects of the reformers. We're switching it now and saying it's the reformers that are affected by these interventions. That's why they act differently to each other. That's the explanation for that. So this raises some questions. That was not the questions. Okay, this raises some questions. What are the implications of this? If this is a hypothesis that says that prisons affect NGOs more than NGOs affect prisons, that NGO practices are somehow determined by the nature of the prison, what are the implications of that? What limits are set for thinking about both prisons and NGOs and interventions and torture prevention work? What limits are set for possible ways of intervening? Does the nature of the relationship ultimately disempower the NGO? Is the NGO task kind of futile? Is it a waste of time? It's certainly true that the NGOs seem to operate from a position of weakness rather than strength. Maybe this means we should think about a martial arts approach, considering ways to use the strength or the weight of the prison itself to unbalance itself. But what I think it does call for is a kind of a rethink, at the very least. And it certainly implies that the notion of independence that I mentioned earlier is an illusion. So our analysis has implications then for typical ways of thinking about rights-based interventions. The idea of independence is one of the most dominant circulating norms intended to inform human rights practice and prison monitoring work. And our study basically suggests that independence is a fantasy. Now, even the UN and its UN bodies that are often responsible for circulating these dominant norms about neutrality and independence, even the UN, at least the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights, recognize that independence is a bit of a dodgy or at least problematic notion. In a training paper, they write the following. I think I did see this, yes. Independence is perhaps the most important principle. It's also arguably the most difficult and controversial. True independence is fundamental to the success of an institution. An institution that cannot operate independently cannot be effective. Now, our study makes us agree with this problematization of independence, but we certainly don't agree with the latter statement that an institution that cannot operate independently cannot be effective, since we don't buy the idea that institutions are ever independent. As I said about the three NGOs, they can each be defined as rights-based NGOs, but they work in very different ways, guided in varying ways by global generic standards, but more significantly guided by the local contexts in which they're trying to work. So their approaches and styles shouldn't be seen as deviations from global blueprints, but rather as meaningful adaptations to specific local contexts of the prisons in which they work. For example, Prison Watch and KRCT adopt almost opposite strategies in bridging the gap between prison practice and international standards for prisons. Both identify a dissonance or a gap between practices and standards, but Prison Watch target frontline officers on the ground to promote change, whereas KRCT target high-level members of the Ministry of Justice or high-level members of the prison authorities. These are distinct approaches. Each makes good contextual sense. In recognition of the meaningfulness of these very different approaches, what we propose is abandoning the norm of independence. We call instead for the acceptance of the need for creativity and flexibility by NGOs as they seek to create their own localized pathways to change. And we think this would be more honest than a constant harking after a fetishized independence. So our analysis shows that NGOs are variously intertwined, entangled, and interlocked, entangled in different ways. They're not separate, they're not neutral, they're not independent. And from this perspective, neutrality and independence are kind of like smoke screens that blind the observer to the complexity of social practice and to the inevitable compromises and the blurring of boundaries that sometimes occurs when institutions coexist and interact. It's not incidental or accidental that I talked about, the sort of risk of complicity, the risk of co-option that's involved in these close relationships. The findings of our study, our critique, if that's what we can call it, of the practice of striving for unobtainable independence, don't speak for abandoning prison work. There came that slide. Okay. So rather than abandoning prison work, actually one of my colleagues, she read our final chapter and she said, so we have to give up, we can't do this stuff because independence is not possible? I said, no, just accept that independence is not possible and work with what you've got. What you've got is interdependent relations. You can work with that. So what we invite to, we invite to new ways of thinking about prison work that recognize the inherent interdependency between NGOs and prisons. We invite to a rethink of how prisons can be changed, abandoning this idea of the NGO as a sort of confrontational, always external outsider. And we invite to an acknowledgement of the unavoidability of at least some level of complicity, and for a conceptualization of encounters between NGOs and prisons in which institutional agency unfolds and where both parties affect each other. And what we believe is that the three NGOs in the study are actually excellent examples of how one can work with rather than against interdependence. What the NGOs in the study do is skillfully negotiate their encounters with prisons, present themselves in different ways to prison officers and prisoners so as to make positive and meaningful contributions in line with their values and mandates. They're able to work with the prison as it is rather than as it is supposed to be. They take the prison seriously even as they wish it were different. This approach enables them, from our perspective at least, to push for real change from a position of being what we might call in the know. They're not outside practice, they're immersed in practice, albeit to varying degrees. Now, full immersion will always carry the risk of drowning, and our proposition is that engaged, involved, committed NGOs, conscious of their limit, conscious of their dependencies, can actually make a serious difference. Stepping inside brings a different and important perspective to bear on prison reform work. To our minds, it's not enough to simply stand at the gate and howl, as my colleague from the University of Washington, Lorna Rhodes, has written. It's not enough to stand at the gate and howl. Need to get inside, need to be involved. So we're inviting to engagement, not a naive engagement, far from it, but from a kind of deliberate and self-aware engagement. But of course, engagement does beg some questions. Might NGOs become so interwoven that they lose their critical edge? Might engaged NGOs have a kind of shelf life that might be exceeded, after which they maybe lose their foothold and succumb to the prison's own equilibrium rather than disrupting it? And these are genuine risks, we think, that any engaged NGO working in and with prisons to change them must consider and reconsider constantly. So to draw to a close, we hope that our findings will contribute to the development of new ways of thinking about change in relation to prisons. Our intention is certainly not to diss prison reform work or the work of NGOs. Our intention is to ground rights-based approaches more solidly in social and institutional realities. Our questioning, that we think is in the spirit of a kind of modest tradition of social scientific research, is designed simply to illuminate social and institutional practices, again, as they are, and to invite a critical rethinking where necessary. Our view, in contrast to OHCHR, is that an organization can only be effective if it honestly discerns its entanglement in complex relations, and if it's conscious about its position in contested practices of power. Thank you very much for your patience.